The moment Myrtle Mercer stepped off her porch into the blinding August sun of 1878, clutching a fistful of bills she had never asked for and did not want, she had no idea that the dusty half-mile walk to the Archer Ranch would change every single thing about her life. Myrtle was 24 years old, brown-haired, brown-eyed, and possessed of the kind of quiet stubbornness that frontier women tended to grow like a second skin. She had lived alone on her small homestead outside the town of Callen's Creek, Texas, for nearly 2 years, ever since her father had passed and left her 40 acres of hard-packed earth, a tired milk cow named Agnes, a modest cabin with a leaking roof, and approximately nothing else of use. She had learned to patch fences, to bargain at the mercantile, to smile pleasantly at men who underestimated her, and then go about her business without them. She was not wealthy. She was not poor exactly, though the line between the two had grown dangerously thin over the summer. But she was proud, and pride, in a woman alone in 1878 Texas, was sometimes the only currency that kept a person upright. The money had appeared in her tin mailbox at the edge of the road on a Tuesday morning. $20, rolled tight and bound with a thin strip of leather, no note, no return address, nothing at all to explain it. $20 was not a small sum. It was, in fact, close to what she earned selling eggs and cream over the course of an entire month. She had stood there at the mailbox with the bills fanned out in her palm, looking left, looking right, seeing nothing but the long, empty road and the shimmering heat pressing down on the land like a weight. She had not spent it. She had set it on her kitchen table and stared at it over supper and stared at it again in the morning. She turned it over and examined the leather strip. She asked old Mrs. Prout at the post office whether anyone had been seen leaving anything in the rural boxes along the Callen's Creek South Road, and Mrs. Prout said she had not noticed a single soul. Myrtle was a practical woman, and practical women did not accept money from mysterious sources. Charity made her stomach tighten with something she recognized as shame, though she tried to reason herself out of that shame regularly. The cabin's roof leaked. Agnes had been limping on her left foreleg for 3 weeks. The winter would come regardless of how she felt about Charity. Still, she could not keep the money. It would sit in her chest like a stone until she returned it to whoever had left it. She had one neighbor within reasonable walking distance. That was the Archer Ranch, which sat on a generous spread of land about half a mile north and west of her property line. She had seen Cyrus Archer from a distance on several occasions, a tall man on a dark horse who moved across his land with the ease of someone who had grown up in the saddle. They had exchanged nods in town. She had heard from various sources that he ran cattle that he kept to himself, that he had come to Callen's Creek about 3 years prior from somewhere further west, and that he was considered a man of quiet reputation, which in that part of Texas meant he paid his debts and did not start fights. He was, to her understanding, the only person who might have reason to leave money in her box, though she could not imagine why. Perhaps he had mistaken her mailbox for someone else's. Perhaps he had put it there by error. She intended to find out, return the money firmly and without much conversation, and walk home. The path between her property and his was a dirt track worn by wagon wheels, and in August it was the color of baked clay. She wore her good calico dress because she was going to a neighbor's property and appearances mattered even on the frontier, and she carried the rolled bills in her left hand loosely, to make it clear from the moment she arrived that she was there to give something back and not to ask for anything. The Archer Ranch came into view around a bend of scrubby live oak trees, and it was larger than she had imagined. The main house was wood-framed, 2 stories, with a wide front porch. The barn was newer than hers by decades. There were horses in a corral to the right, fine ones, a buckskin and 2 sorrels in the dark one she recognized as his. There was a bunkhouse further back, and a water trough, and a vegetable garden on the south side of the house that struck her as surprising, because vegetable gardens in her experience were kept by women, not by solitary cattle ranchers. She walked to the front door and knocked. There was a pause, the sounds of boots on wood inside, and then the door opened. Cyrus Archer was not what she had expected up close. He was perhaps 30, or close to it, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the precise color of creek water after rain, a kind of gray-green that shifted depending on the angle of the light. He was broad-shouldered in a way that came from actual work rather than display, with the particular kind of leanness that belonged to men who spent long days on horseback. He had a scar at the corner of his jaw that she noticed and immediately told herself she had not noticed. He was looking at her with an expression of genuine surprise, like a man who had not been expecting company and was not entirely sure whether the company was good news or bad. "Miss Mercer," he said. His voice was lower than she had anticipated and careful, like a man who chose words with some deliberation. "Mr. Archer," she said, "I am sorry to trouble you. I will be brief." She held out the money. He looked at it, then he looked at her. "I found this in my mailbox Tuesday morning," she said. "No note, no name. I cannot think of who else might have put it there. I am returning it to you." He was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than politeness recommended. Then he said, "Miss Mercer, I don't know what you're talking about." She blinked. "I beg your pardon. I didn't put any money in your mailbox," he said. He was not unkind about it. He was just clear. "I'm sorry you've had a puzzle of it, but that money didn't come from me." She looked at him carefully. He met her eyes without flinching, without the particular sideways quality that men tended to develop when they were being dishonest. He looked genuinely puzzled, and she found herself uncertain in a way she had not anticipated. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I am," he said. She looked down at the money in her hand. Then she looked back up at him. "All right," she said. "I apologize for troubling you." "No trouble," he said. She walked home. She put the money back on her table. She looked at it for a long time and then put it in the tin box under her bed where she kept her savings and told herself she would figure it out eventually. 3 weeks later, the money was back. Not the same bills, or at least she could not be sure they were the same bills because money was money. But the same amount, the same tight roll, the same thin strip of leather. It was sitting in her mailbox on a Wednesday morning when she went to collect whatever post Mrs. Prout might have forwarded, and she stood there in the road in her work apron with her hands on her hips and felt a flush of something that was equal parts irritation and bewilderment. She did not deliberate this time. She tucked the money in her apron pocket, finished her chores, washed her face and hands, changed into the calico dress again, and walked back up the road to the Archer ranch. He answered the door again, and this time he looked less surprised to see her and more like a man bracing for something he could not quite identify. He was in his work clothes, a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he was holding a mug of coffee, and the domesticity of it struck her as unexpectedly human. She held out the money without preamble. "It happened again," she said. "Same amount, same leather strip, Mr. Archer. I do not want to accuse you of anything, but I cannot keep money I did not earn, and you are the only neighbor I have." He stared at the bills. He stared at her, and he said with the same steady directness as before, "Miss Mercer, I genuinely do not know what you are talking about." She searched his face. There was nothing there but honest confusion and perhaps the faintest edge of something that looked almost like amusement, though he was keeping it carefully under control. "Twice now," she said, because it bore saying aloud. "Twice now I have told you I don't know anything about it," he agreed. There was a silence between them that was longer than the first one, and in that silence something shifted, because they were both standing there looking at the same small mystery and neither of them had an answer, and shared confusion, it turned out, was a kind of intimacy. "Well," she said finally. "Well," he said. She did not leave immediately, which surprised her. She said, "If it were not you, then who?" He leaned against the doorframe and considered this with what appeared to be genuine interest. "You have any other neighbors? Anyone passing through regular?" "No one who would have reason," she said. "I barely know anyone in town well enough for this." "Someone doing you a kindness," he said, "anonymously." "I do not want anonymous kindness," she said, and heard how prickly that sounded and softened it. "That is, I appreciate the intention, but I can manage on my own." Something moved in his eyes at that, something careful and recognizing. "I know that feeling," he said. She looked at him. "Sit down," he said. "I'll get you a cup of coffee and we can think on it." She should have gone home. She knew she should have gone home. Instead, she sat down on his porch in the morning shade and accepted a mug of coffee that turned out to be very good, better than her own, which she attributed to his having a finer grade of beans. And they sat together for the better part of an hour and talked about the mystery of the money, and then, gradually, about other things. She learned that he was 29, not 30. She learned that he had come from New Mexico territory, where he had worked a cattle operation belonging to a man named Hadley who had eventually sold the ranch and retired east, which had left Cyrus with enough saved wages to purchase the Callen's Creek property and a small starting herd. She learned that he had grown the herd to something respectable over 3 years through careful management and a good eye for stock, and that he did indeed maintain his own vegetable garden because, as he put it with a completely straight face, he could not afford to be a man who did not eat vegetables. She told him in return about her father's death and the 40 acres and Agnes the limping cow and the leaking roof, and he listened with the kind of attention that felt genuine rather than polite, his eyes on her face, his coffee mug held in both hands. "What happened to the cow?" he asked, which was not the question she had expected. "She is better now," Myrtle said. "It was the left foreleg, a stone bruise, I think. I soaked it and wrapped it and kept her in for 2 weeks." "You did that yourself?" "There was no one else to do it," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Mercer, if you ever need help with anything on your property, I mean that seriously, not as charity, just as neighboring." She looked at him. He held her look. She decided to believe he meant exactly what he had said and no more, and said, "Thank you, Mr. Archer. The same goes in reverse should you ever need it." He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. The corner of his mouth moved, and the scar at his jaw pulled slightly, and she told herself again that she had not noticed any of that. She walked home with the $20 still in her pocket, because they had not resolved the question of its origin, and she could not in good conscience return it to a man who genuinely seemed not to know anything about it. The next week she baked a pie. This was, she told herself, entirely practical. She had a surplus of early apples from the 2 trees at the back of her property, far more than she could use or sell before they turned, and it was neighborly to share surplus produce. That was all. She knocked on his door on a Thursday afternoon with an apple pie wrapped in a towel and told herself that looking forward to the knock had nothing to do with the man inside. He opened the door and looked at the pie and then at her, and this time he did smile, not the almost of before but a real one, and it did something uncomfortable to the inside of her chest. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Surplus apples," she said. "Come in," he said. She had not been inside yet. The house was cleaner than she had expected, spare and orderly in the way that spoke not of a woman's hand, but of a man who kept things because keeping things was in his nature. There were shelves of books along one wall that stopped her cold because she had not expected books. "You read," she said, and immediately felt foolish for how it sounded. "When I can," he said. "Do you?" "Every chance I get," she said, and they stood there in the middle of his sitting room looking at each other over a pie, and she thought that she had been wrong about quite a few things where Cyrus Archer was concerned. He cut the pie and they ate it at his kitchen table with more of his very good coffee, and they talked about books, and then about the nature of the land in this part of Texas versus other parts they had known, and then about the coming fall and what the season was likely to bring. She stayed 2 hours. It was the most she had talked to another person in months. Walking home, she thought about the money still sitting in the tin box under her bed. It had been 5 weeks since the first delivery. She was no closer to knowing where it had come from. She thought about Cyrus Archer's face when she had held the bills out to him, the genuine confusion in his Creekwater eyes. She thought about him saying twice, with equal steadiness, that he did not know what she was talking about. She believed him. She was not sure why that realization was accompanied by a small, treacherous warmth in the region of her sternum, but she noted it and filed it away and told herself to be sensible. In September, a complication arrived in the form of a man named Dale Prentice. Prentice was 45, a land agent out of San Antonio who had come to Callen's Creek representing interests that he described, in the careful way of men who want to sound larger than they are, as a consortium of investors. He arrived at Myrtle's door on a Thursday with his hat in his hands and a smile that went all the way to his teeth but not quite to his eyes. And he explained that his investors were interested in acquiring land in the Callen's Creek corridor for a proposed rail line, and that her 40 acres were in a location that made them particularly desirable, and that he was prepared to offer her a sum that he named, and that made her breath catch, because it was more money than she had ever held a concept of. She said she would think about it. After he left, she sat down at her kitchen table and thought about it with the hard, clear part of her mind that she kept specifically for problems requiring clear thinking. The offer was real money, enough to go somewhere, start something new, live without the constant arithmetic of survival. But the 40 acres was her father's land. It was her land. It was the only thing she had that was fully hers, and selling it would mean leaving Callen's Creek. And leaving Callen's Creek would mean, among other things, not walking up the road to Cyrus Archer's porch anymore. She recognized that thought for what it was and sat with it honestly for a moment before folding it back and setting it aside. She still had not solved the money problem. The $20 was still under her bed. She had begun to wonder, in the late evenings when her mind was not occupied with practical things, whether the mystery was connected to anything, or whether it was simply one of those odd small events that frontier life produced without explanation. She went to town the following Saturday, as she usually did, and at the mercantile she encountered Cyrus Archer buying a coil of rope and a tin of saddle oil. He saw her and removed his hat, and they fell into step together outside the store without particularly deciding to. "Have you heard about the land agent?" she asked, because the whole town seemed to be talking about Prentice and his rail consortium. "He came to see me Wednesday," Cyrus said. He was walking slowly to match her pace, leading his horse by the reins, made an offer on the north section. "And I told him no," he said. "This is my land, I built something on it." She looked at him. "He came to me too." His expression changed. Not dramatically, because he was not a man of dramatic expressions, but something in it sharpened and became more attentive. "What did you tell him?" "That I would think about it," she said. "Are you thinking about it?" "Yes," she said honestly. He was quiet for a moment. They walked past the post office and the saddle shop and the barber. The town of Callen's Creek was not large, but it was alive with the particular energy of a Saturday. Horses at the hitching rails, women comparing fabric samples outside the dry goods store, men gathered on the steps of the saloon though it was barely noon. "The money is still under my bed," she said, because she was not sure why she said it, only that she wanted him to know it was still unresolved, that she was still thinking about it. He looked at her sideways. "You put it under your bed, in a tin box with my savings. You could have spent it." "It's not mine to spend," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped with him, and they were standing in the middle of the dusty main street of Callen's Creek, and he was looking at her with the attentiveness that she had learned in the last few weeks was his particular form of seriousness. "Myrtle," he said, and her name in his mouth without the miss was something she had not been prepared for. "Whoever put that money there wanted to help you. Maybe you ought to let yourself be helped." "That's easy to say," she said. "I know it is," he said. "I've said it to myself 100 times and it never gets easier." She looked at him. There it was again, that quality of recognition, the sense of two people who had learned the same lesson in different landscapes and were surprised to find themselves standing in the same town speaking the same private language. "I'm not selling my land," she said. "Good," he said, and there was a quiet emphasis on it that she felt all the way down to her boots. October arrived the way it does in South Texas, not in the blaze of color that other regions produced, but in a subtler shift, a drying of the air, a particular quality to the light in the early morning, the grass turning from green to a pale gold. Myrtle had the roof patched by a carpenter named Flores from town, and the cost of it left her finances in a state that required careful management for the rest of the year. She sold eggs at the mercantile, and cream, and the quilts she spent her evenings making with the fabric she bought cheaply from the remnant bin. She was managing. She was always managing. She and Cyrus Archer had fallen into a pattern that neither of them had named. On Saturdays they saw each other in town and walked together to their horses. On occasional weekday mornings, she would be at her mailbox when he rode past on his way to the east pasture, and he would stop, and they would talk for 20 minutes about nothing in particular and everything. Once he came to her door with a problem he had with his vegetable garden, a blight on the tomato plants that she identified from her father's farming almanac as a fungal issue, and treated with a dusting of sulfur powder that she happened to have. He stood in her garden and watched her work with his arms folded and the expression of a man trying to memorize something. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "My father," she said. "He kept this almanac for 40 years. May I see it?" She gave him the almanac, and he read 3 pages of it standing in her garden before he seemed to realize he was doing it and looked up slightly self-consciously. "Take it," she said. "Bring it back when you're done." He brought it back 2 weeks later with a note tucked inside it, a piece of folded paper on which he had written, in a careful hand that told her he had spent time at it, a list of questions about the fungal treatment and 2 additional agricultural problems he had encountered, framed as questions rather than requests for help. She read the note at her kitchen table and felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the October sun. She wrote him back. Not a short response, but a full letter, answering his questions and adding her own observations about the land in this particular county, and she walked it to his door that afternoon and knocked. He was not home. She left it in his mailbox, which she noticed for the first time was the same model as hers, a simple tin box on a post at the edge of his drive, and the sight of it made her stand there for a moment thinking about the money. He came to her door the next morning. "Your letter," he said when she opened it. He was holding it slightly creased like something he had read more than once. "I wanted to thank you." "You wrote to me first," she said. "You wrote better," he said. She laughed. She had not expected to laugh, and the sound of it surprised both of them. His face opened completely when she laughed, the careful arrangement of it releasing into something younger and unguarded, and she realized that she had been wanting to see that face for weeks without quite admitting it to herself. "Come in," she said. "I made biscuits." He came in, and they sat at her kitchen table with biscuits and the last of her summer preserves, and they talked until the morning was gone and the noon sun was high. And she noticed that at some point she had stopped thinking of him as her neighbor and started thinking of him simply as Cyrus, the same way she thought of herself as Myrtle, without ceremony, without title, as a basic fact of the landscape. It was at this point that the money matter became unexpectedly resolved, and the resolution came from the most unlikely direction. Mrs. Pruitt at the post office was not only the postmistress, but was also, in the way of postmistresses in small towns everywhere, the keeper of a great deal of information that the town's residents did not realize she kept. She was 71 years old, sharp as a skinning knife, and fond of Myrtle because Myrtle was one of the few people who brought her preserves and asked after her health as though she actually wanted to know the answer. On a November Saturday, Mrs. Pruitt beckoned Myrtle behind the counter with a look that indicated confidential communication. "I know about your mailbox mystery," she said, in a low voice that carried all the satisfaction of a woman who has been keeping a secret and is finally, reasonably releasing it. Myrtle stared. "What do you know?" "I know who put the money there," Mrs. Pruitt said, "both times." "Who?" Myrtle asked, though she was simultaneously certain and terrified of the answer. "Old Tom Bidwell," Mrs. Pruitt said. Myrtle blinked. Tom Bidwell. Tom Bidwell was 73 years old, a retired cattle drover who had known her father for 30 years and who lived on a small parcel at the edge of town with his wife Clara. He was not Myrtle's nearest neighbor. He was not someone she saw often. He was, she now recalled, one of the men who had stood at her father's graveside in the spring of 1876 and pressed her hand and said that if she ever needed anything. He told Clara, Mrs. Prout said, with the quiet gravity of someone delivering important news. And Clara told me, because Clara cannot keep anything from me for more than 3 weeks, it is a constitutional inability. He saw your roof last summer, the leaking part, and he thought your father's girl ought not to be living under a leaking roof. He put the money in your box so you wouldn't know it was charity. Myrtle stood very still. He was mortified when you came back asking, Mrs. Prout added, with a small, fond smile. Clara said he nearly told you 3 times and then couldn't bring himself to. The second time you came around asking the neighborhood, he panicked and put more money in because he thought you'd needed more. Myrtle thought about the rolled bills, the leather strip, Tom Bidwell's large, careful hands, which she remembered from her father's funeral, the kind of hands that belonged to a man who had tied a great many things carefully in his life. She thought about Cyrus Archer's face, twice, saying with perfect honesty that he did not know what she was talking about. She stood there in the post office for a long moment, and then she did something she had not done since her father died. She put her face in her hands and cried, not unhappily, but with the complicated relief of someone who has been carrying a puzzle and has finally been given the last piece. Mrs. Prout patted her shoulder and offered a handkerchief and did not say anything unnecessary, which was one of her better qualities. Myrtle composed herself. She thanked Mrs. Prout. She bought her stamps. She walked directly to Tom Bidwell's house at the edge of town and knocked on the door. Tom Bidwell answered it and looked at her face and immediately looked like a man who wished very much that he could become part of the porch. "Tom," she said gently. "Myrtle," he said. "It was you," she said. He looked at his boots. He was a big man, broad and weathered, with white hair and the particular dignity of old cowhands, and he looked, standing there, like a very large child who had been caught at something. "Your father was my friend for 30 years, he said finally, "and he'd have wanted someone looking out for you." She stepped forward and hugged him, which surprised them both. He stood still for a moment with his arms at his sides, and then he put them around her carefully, the way men of his generation hugged when they were moved and unsure what to do about it. "Thank you," she said. "The roof is fixed now." "I know," he said. "I checked." She laughed, and he laughed, and Clara appeared at his shoulder with the expression of someone who had been listening from the hallway and was very relieved about how this was going. Myrtle walked home with the money still in her pocket and a lightness in her chest that had been absent for a long time. She thought about what to do with it. She thought about Tom Bidwell and the particular, old-fashioned gallantry of what he had done. She thought about her father, who had apparently been the kind of man who inspired loyalty across 30 years and through death, which she had known but had not quite felt in her body until this moment. She thought also about Cyrus Archer, about the way he had looked at her both times when she had held the money out to him, genuinely confused and yet not dismissive, treating her small puzzle as something worth taking seriously, about the almanac note, the careful handwriting, about the biscuits they had eaten at her table while the morning disappeared around them. She went home and put the money in an envelope addressed to Tom and Clara Bidwell and labeled it, with a sense of poetry she allowed herself to feel, for Christmas. She would figure out something useful to do with it on their behalf, a barrel of good provisions, perhaps, or a contribution to the church fund for the new roof they had been raising money for. It was the right solution. It restored some kind of balance. Then she sat down and wrote Cyrus a letter. She wrote that she had solved the mystery of the money. She wrote what Mrs. Prout had told her about Tom Bidwell and his loyalty to her father and his panic when she had come asking. She wrote that she had gone to thank him and that it had been, unexpectedly, one of the most affecting things that had happened to her in some time. She wrote, at the end, that she was sorry for having appeared at his door twice accusing him of something he had not done, and that she was grateful for the patience with which he had denied it. She folded the letter and started to put it in an envelope and then stopped, read it back, and wrote one more line. She wrote, "I think I would like to know you better if you are willing." She sealed the envelope before she could take the last line back. She walked to his mailbox and put it in. He appeared at her door the following morning with his hat in his hand and a look on his face that she recognized immediately as a man who has read a letter more than once. "I am willing," he said. She stepped back from the door and let him in, and they sat at her kitchen table for the third time, though it felt different this time, like something had been declared that had previously been spoken only in the language of pies and almanacs and borrowed handkerchiefs. They talked. They talked for a long time. She learned more about New Mexico, about the particular quality of the light over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in winter, about a man named Hadley who had been both employer and something close to a father figure, who had died 2 years before Cyrus came to Texas. She told him more about her own father, about the way he had taught her to read a weather sky and identify fungal blight and keep accounts, about the particular way he had of saying good morning, as if he meant it about the whole world, not just the day. At noon, Cyrus helped her carry a bag of grain from her storage to the barn, because she had been putting it off for a week on account of her back, and they worked side by side in the close air of the barn, while Agnes watched them with the profound disinterest of a recovered cow. He was easy to work with. He moved in the same measured, unhurried way that he spoke. She noticed that he noticed things, small things, the way a beam had shifted slightly in the corner, the way her water barrel had developed a seam that would need sealing before winter. "You have a good eye," she said. "Long practice," he said. He stayed through supper, which happened by the natural process of it being supper time, and both of them still having things to say. She made salt pork and cornbread, and there was coffee after, and they sat across from each other at the table with the oil lamp between them and the dark pressing softly against the windows, and she thought, quietly and clearly, that this was what she had been wanting without knowing it. Not rescue, not someone to solve her problems, but someone to sit across from at the end of a day and talk to. He rode home in the full dark, and she stood on her porch and watched the lamp of his lantern moving away across the land until the darkness swallowed it. And then she went inside and washed the dishes, feeling more settled than she had in years. November became December and the courtship, because that is what it was by now, though neither of them had used that word, settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as weather. He came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She came to him on Fridays. They went to town together on Saturdays, and people noticed but were polite about it in the way of small communities that understood when something good was happening and chose not to disturb it. Mrs. Prout watched them walk past her window and smiled the smile of a woman who knows she has contributed materially to an outcome she approves of. Dale Prentice came back in late November. He appeared at Myrtle's door on a Tuesday afternoon when Cyrus happened to be there, and the look on Prentice's face when he saw the man at her kitchen table told Myrtle something she had not known she wanted to know, that Prentice had been counting on her isolation in a way that was more than professional. "Miss Mercer," Prentice said from the doorway, "I've brought an improved offer." "Miss Mercer isn't interested," Cyrus said from the table. He said it quietly and without heat, the way a man says something that is simply true. Prentice looked at him, then he looked at Myrtle. "Is that so?" "It is," Myrtle said, because she had been about to say so herself, and she appreciated that Cyrus had said it first only so that she could confirm it and the confirmation would carry all the weight. "I am not interested, Mr. Prentice. Not at any price. This land belonged to my father and it belongs to me, and it is not for sale." Prentice studied her for a moment with the look of a man recalculating. Then he looked at Cyrus again and seemed to decide that the calculation did not favor further argument. "The consortium's offer stands for 30 days, he said, "if you change your mind." "I won't," she said. He left. She closed the door and turned back to the table and found Cyrus watching her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was doing most of the things a smile does. "Thank you," she said, "for what you said." "You were going to say it anyway," he said. "I was," she said, but it was nice to have someone say it with me." His expression shifted then into something quieter and more serious, and he looked at his coffee mug for a moment and then back at her. "Myrtle," he said. "Yes," she said. "I've been thinking about something for a while now," he said, "and I want to say it plainly rather than talk around it for another month." She sat down across from him and set her hands in her lap and gave him her full attention. "I have lived alone for a long time," he said. "By choice mostly. I don't find it easy to let people close. The few times I have, things went sideways in ways that made the distance seem worth it." He paused. "And then you walked up to my door with your fist full of money that didn't belong to me, and you looked at me like you were fully prepared to stand there in the sun all day until the matter was resolved. And I thought, that is a woman worth knowing." She looked at him carefully. His hands were around his coffee mug, and he was holding her gaze with the particular steadiness she had come to understand was his form of courage. "The second time," he said, "when you came back and said it had happened again, I thought, the money is secondary. She came back. That was the thing that stayed with me." Myrtle felt the warmth in her chest that she had been noting and filing away for 2 months spread outward in a way she could no longer practically contain. "I am not good at being helpless," she said carefully, "or at depending on people. I learned early that depending on people is a way of getting hurt when they go." "I know," he said. "But I have been sitting across from you at this table every Tuesday for 2 months," she said, "and I have not once wished you would leave." He was quiet. The lamp between them gave off its small yellow light. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you'll have me. I mean that in the old-fashioned sense where a man is clear about his intentions and works toward them honorably." "What are your intentions?" she asked, because she was a practical woman and she wanted to hear it said. "To marry you," he said. "Eventually, when we've had enough time to be sure, which I think we're getting close to, but to court you properly first, with your permission." She sat with this for a moment. Outside the window, the December wind moved through the live oaks, and the lamp flame shifted slightly in response. "Yes," she said, "you have my permission." He picked up his coffee mug and took a deliberate sip, and she watched the line of his jaw and the way the lamplight moved in his eyes and thought that she was, quite quietly and quite certainly, falling in love with this man. December in Callen's Creek was not the harsh winter of northern territories, but it had its own austere beauty, the grass silver with frost in the mornings, the sky at dusk turning colors that had no good names in English. Myrtle and Cyrus went to the Christmas service at the Methodist church together, which settled the town's remaining speculation about them into comfortable certainty. And afterward, there was a gathering at the Bidwell house, because Clara Bidwell held an annual open door and everyone came. Myrtle introduced Cyrus to Tom Bidwell in Clara's sitting room, and the two men shook hands and took each other's measure in the way men did. And then Tom said, "I hear you've got good cattle out there on the South Road." And Cyrus said, "I hear you drove cattle for 30 years in this country." And they were in conversation for 40 minutes while Myrtle and Clara sat by the fire and ate fruitcake, and watched them with the comfortable satisfaction of women who have arranged things well. Though neither of them had arranged anything at all. "He's a good one," Clara said, with the authority of a woman who had assessed a great many men over 72 years. "I think so," Myrtle said. "Tom likes him," Clara said, as if this settled it entirely. Walking home in the cold blue dark of Christmas evening, Cyrus put his hand under Myrtle's arm to help her across the frozen rut in the road, and then did not quite remove it, and she did not quite step away, and they walked the rest of the way to her gate that way, his hand warm through her coat sleeve, the stars very close and very clear overhead. At her gate he stopped. She stopped with him. The air smelled of cold earth and cedar smoke from her chimney. "Merry Christmas, Myrtle," he said. "Merry Christmas, Cyrus," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead, brief and warm, and stepped back. She stood at her gate after he had gone and pressed her hand to the place his lips had been, which she knew was ridiculous, and did it anyway, and then went inside and sat by her own fire with a feeling in her chest like the opening of a door that had been closed a very long time. January was cold and close and wonderful. Cyrus came every day now, or nearly, sometimes for an hour and sometimes for most of the day, and when the weather was poor they sat inside with books or conversation or the particular comfortable quiet that was, Myrtle had come to understand, the most reliable indicator that two people were suited to each other. If you could be silent with a person and not feel the need to fill the silence, that was something. In January, the problem with Prentice resurfaced, not Prentice himself but the consortium he represented. It became known through the sort of town information network that Mrs. Prout anchored that the rail interest had not given up on the Callen's Creek corridor, and that they were now applying pressure through legal and semi-legal channels, disputing property boundaries, challenging old deed records, the tactics of men with money and lawyers in a time when homesteaders often had neither. Two of Myrtle's neighbors along the South Road had already given in and sold. She was not going to, but she began to understand that not selling might require more than determination. She went to see the county land agent in Callen's Creek, a man named Hartwell who was honest, which was relatively rare in land agents, and was the reason he was less prosperous than Prentice. Hartwell examined her deed and told her it was solid, recorded correctly, with no ambiguity in the boundary descriptions. He also told her that Prentice's consortium had hired a lawyer from San Antonio who had made a career of finding ambiguity where none existed, and that she should be careful. She told Cyrus that evening. He listened with his arms folded, and his face doing the thing it did when he was thinking hard, the slight furrow, the focused stillness. "My deed is in good order too," he said, "and I've been keeping the boundary markers maintained, every post, every corner stake." "Mine too," she said. "My father was meticulous." "Then they won't find anything to challenge," he said. "And if they try anyway, we fight it together." She looked at him across the kitchen table. "Together. You're not alone in this," he said. "That's what I mean." She was not alone. She had been alone for 2 years, and she had become so accustomed to it that the fact of not being alone felt almost physical, like warmth in a room she had stopped expecting to be warm. "Cyrus," she said. "Yes." "The 30 days Prentice gave me are long past," she said, "and I notice that they haven't come back." "Because they assessed the situation," he said. "They're not going to fight 2 adjacent properties with clear deeds if they can get what they need from the properties already sold." "You think it's over?" "I think it's likely to be over," he said, "but I'll keep my eye on it." He did. He spoke to Hartwell himself the following week, and then, on a subsequent trip to the county seat, he reviewed the relevant documents personally and came back satisfied that the consortium's interest had, as he had predicted, shifted north along the proposed rail line to easier acquisitions. Myrtle's 40 acres were safe. She received this news standing in her barn with a pitchfork in her hand and felt, for the first time in months, the particular relief of a woman who has been holding her breath and finally need not. "Thank you," she said to Cyrus, who was leaning against the barn doorframe. "I didn't do anything that mattered," he said. "Your deed did the work." "You went to the county seat," she said. "I had errands in that direction," he said. She set the pitchfork against the wall and walked toward him, and then, before she had fully decided to, she stood on her toes and kissed him. It was a brief kiss, almost startled out of her by her own relief and warmth, but it landed squarely and he did not pull back. Instead, he put his hand very gently at her jaw, just for a moment, and when she stepped back they were both quiet in the way of people who have arrived somewhere significant. "Well," he said. "Well," she said, which was what they always said, and somehow it was funnier now than it had ever been, and she laughed, and he did, and the barn was full of the sound of it, and Agnes watched them both with her large, untroubled eyes. February came. The courtship, already somewhat beyond the formal stage after the barn episode, deepened into something that Myrtle could only describe to herself in architectural terms, something structural being built between them, beam by beam, in the language of daily life. He knew how she took her coffee. She knew that he read for an hour before sleep and could not do so if there was a sound he had not identified. So she always said good night when he left her gate so that his ride home was quiet. She knew he had a particular dislike of pretension and a particular fondness for practical intelligence. He knew she was most in her own mind in the early morning and should not be pressed into conversation before her first cup, and that she was most herself in the kitchen in the evenings, and said the things she meant most honestly at the end of the day. He proposed on the 15th of February, 1879. He had come for supper and they had eaten and cleaned up and were sitting by the fire with their books, which was their Friday evening arrangement, and he closed his book and set it on the arm of the chair and looked at her. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked up from her own book. His expression told her what was coming before the words did, and she felt something in her settle, like the last thing in a room finally finding its right place. "I have been working on this since before Christmas," he said, "and the truth is there is no arrangement of words that does it justice, so I am going to say it plainly. I want you to be my wife. Not because you need someone to help with the roof or because I need someone to treat my garden blight, because I cannot imagine my days well without you in them, because you are the best person I know, because when I think about the future I want, you are in every version of it." He paused. "I know you value your independence. I am not asking you to surrender it. I am asking you to choose it alongside mine, which I think is a different thing." She held his gaze. The fire moved between them and the wind worked at the windows and the February dark pressed close around the small lit warmth of her cabin. "Yes," she said, "that is a different thing. Is that a yes?" He asked, and the careful hope in his face at that moment was the most purely human thing she had ever seen. "Yes," she said, "that is a yes." He came out of his chair and she stood up and he put his arms around her and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood that way for a long moment, not kissing, just holding on, with the fire crackling and the wind outside and the total, complete rightness of it. They were married in April of 1879 at the Methodist Church in Callen's Creek, on a morning so clear and so golden that the air itself seemed to celebrate the occasion. The church was small and the congregation was half the town, because small towns turn out for weddings the way they turn out for nothing else. And Tom and Clara Bidwell sat in the front row with expressions of people who feel personally responsible for good outcomes they had nothing to do with, which was accurate in Tom's case in the most roundabout way possible, since it was his $20, after all, that had sent Myrtle up the road to Cyrus Archer's door. Mrs. Prout wore her best hat and cried cheerfully through the entire ceremony. Myrtle wore her mother's dress, which she had taken in at the waist and let out slightly at the shoulders, cream-colored cotton with small embroidered flowers at the collar, and she carried wildflowers from her own property, because she had walked out in the morning dew and picked them herself and they were hers, and they suited her better than anything arranged by someone else. Cyrus wore his good dark coat and a necktie that he had clearly tied 3 times based on the slight tension in his expression when he first appeared at the front of the church, and when he saw her come through the door his expression released entirely into something so open and unguarded that she had to look away for a moment to keep herself composed. They spoke their vows in the clear, carrying voices of people who meant every syllable. The celebration afterward was at the Bidwells, because Clara would not hear of anything else, and there was food enough for twice the people present, and someone produced a fiddle and someone else a banjo, and the afternoon became a dance that lasted until the lanterns were lit and the stars were out, and even Tom Bidwell's arthritic hip could not entirely keep him sitting still. Myrtle danced with Cyrus in the yellow lantern light of Clara Bidwell's yard, and thought about the morning she had walked up the road with a fist full of someone else's money and knocked on a door, and about the face that had appeared in that doorway, confused and careful and interesting, and about how every single thing that mattered in her life now had started from that small, ordinary, improbable moment. "What are you thinking?" Cyrus said quietly in her ear. "Tom Bidwell," she said. He laughed. He had a good laugh, full and real, and she had never gotten tired of hearing it. "Tom Bidwell," he agreed. "If he hadn't put that money in my box," she said. "If you hadn't been too proud to keep it," he said. "I was right not to keep it," she said. "You were absolutely right," he said. "And if you hadn't been, we wouldn't be here, so I am very glad of your particular kind of stubbornness." She pressed her cheek to his shoulder and let the music move them through the warm April night. They had decided on the practical question of whose property before the wedding with the same directness they brought to everything else. Her 40 acres and his much larger ranch operation were adjacent, and it made sense to work them together. Cyrus had offered to build onto her cabin, to make the larger house their home, as a gesture toward the land that had been her father's. She had said that was generous, and that she preferred his house because it had more rooms and better windows, and they could call her land the South Pasture and use it for grazing. He had looked at her for a moment, and then said that she was one of the most consistently sensible people he had ever met, which she took as the high compliment it was intended to be. So she moved her things to the Archer house in April, and her side of it gradually accumulated the particular texture of her presence: the almanacs, the quilting frames, the good iron skillet, the tin box that had once held the mysterious money and now held nothing except a few dried wildflowers she had pressed without quite deciding to, and which she kept without analyzing the reason. Spring on the ranch was full. There were calves to see too, fences that had suffered over winter, the vegetable garden to be replanted now with 2 people working it instead of 1, which made it twice the size and twice the pleasure. Myrtle found that she loved the ranch in a way she had not quite expected, the scale of it, the way a large operation required the same daily attention as a small one, but accumulated into something visible. She learned cattle the way she had learned chickens and garden blight, methodically and from good sources, and Cyrus, who was a patient teacher when he had a student willing to learn, taught her the things she did not know and let her teach him in return. In June, they hired a hand named Robbie, a young man of 20 from a family in town who needed the work, and proved to be reliable with the horses and willing to learn everything else. Robbie was cheerful and a little talkative and treated Myrtle with the particular respectful deference of a young man who has been well raised, and she found she liked having him around the way she had never expected to like having anyone around. The summer was good. The cattle were healthy and the garden was productive, and the evenings were long and warm, and Myrtle would sometimes sit on the porch in the blue hour between daylight and dark with Cyrus beside her, their chairs angled toward each other, talking or not talking as the evening required, and think that this was what people meant when they talked about a life. Not the dramatic events, not the resolutions of conflicts, but this, the sustained, daily, ordinary pleasure of a life built with someone. She found that she was happy. It had been some time since she had thought about herself in those terms, not surviving, not managing, not maintaining, but actually, factually happy, and the newness of thinking it was still faintly startling, the way your eyes need time to adjust to more light. In September, she told Cyrus she was expecting. They were at breakfast, which was always her best time to say things because her mind was clear in the morning and she had learned to trust it, and she said it simply and directly, which was how she said everything. He went very still for a moment. Then he put down his coffee mug and looked at her with an expression that she had not seen before on his face, not the careful steadiness or the quiet warmth or the considering attention, but something cracked completely open, like a window thrown up on a summer morning. He came around the table and took both her hands in his and looked at her and did not say anything for a moment because, she understood, he could not. "Good," he finally said, which was a very small word for a very large feeling, and she felt it completely. "Good," she agreed. They told Tom and Clara Bidwell first, because it felt right, and Tom pressed Cyrus's hand for a long time and Clara cried and said she had been hoping, and that she had been praying. Mrs. Prout, when they told her, said she had suspected as much for 2 weeks, and pulled out a parcel from under the counter that turned out to be a set of small cotton nightgowns she had been piecing together in the evenings, which was the single most unexpectedly tender thing Myrtle had witnessed in some time. And she hugged Mrs. Prout for a long moment in the middle of the post office, while the postmistress stood very straight and pretended she was not moved. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was mild, and Myrtle moved through it with the particular weightedness and clarity that pregnancy brought, more attentive to small things, more deliberate in her movements, more aware of the texture of days. Cyrus hovered in a way that would have irritated her from anyone else, and from him she mostly found endearing, though she did tell him on 3 separate occasions that she was pregnant, not ill, and was fully capable of carrying a bucket of water from the well. He took over carrying the water anyway, which she allowed, because there were some battles not worth winning. Their son was born in March of 1880, in the upstairs room of the house on the Archer ranch, delivered by the doctor from Callen's Creek and attended by Clara Bidwell, who had appointed herself to that role without being asked, and whom Myrtle had been very glad of in the event. The birth was hard and long, and at the end of it Myrtle was very tired and very certain she had never been so glad to be tired in her life. They named him James, after Myrtle's father. Cyrus held James for the first time standing by the window in the gray March morning light, holding the baby with both arms the way a man holds something he is afraid of dropping and afraid of holding too tightly. And the look on his face was the one she had seen for the first time when she had told him she was expecting, cracked open and flooded with something that had no smaller word than love. She watched him and thought about Tuesdays and almanacs and fistfuls of money and tin boxes, and the particular, improbable mercy of small things. James was a good baby, in the sense that he had strong opinions about what he wanted and was vigorous in expressing them, which Myrtle thought of as a reasonable character trait in a person who could not yet speak. He grew with the steady purposefulness of ranch children, fed well and loved thoroughly, carried on his father's hip when Cyrus walked the property, sat in the garden to watch the weeding with the philosophical expression of a person supervising operations. Tom Bidwell came to see the baby on his second day home and stood over the cradle with his big, weathered hands at his sides and said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "Your grandfather would have been proud." And Myrtle, who had been doing extremely well at keeping herself composed, had to turn and look at the window for a moment. The spring of 1880 and the summer that followed it were full in the way of seasons that contain life in the active sense. The ranch growing, the herd healthy, James learning first to roll and then to sit, and then to pull himself upright at the leg of whatever furniture was nearby, and regard the world from the new altitude with enormous satisfaction. Robbie, their hand, turned out to have a talent with the cattle that went beyond reliability, and Cyrus gave him more responsibility and eventually a share in the operation's profits, which was the kind of arrangement that Myrtle had approved of immediately and that Cyrus had arrived at himself, which was one of the things she most valued about him. In September of 1880, Mrs. Prout retired. The retirement was announced in the way of small-town announcements, somewhat gradually, with the actual date shifting several times as Mrs. Prout found it difficult in practice to leave the post office to its new occupant, a young man named Foster from the county seat, who did not know which residents preferred their mail sorted by first name and which by last. She spent 3 weeks in nominal retirement, coming to the post office every other day to supervise Foster, which he bore with the patience of a man who understood that some knowledge could only be transferred by direct observation. Myrtle and Cyrus hosted a small dinner for her at the ranch house, which included Tom and Clara Bidwell and the Reverend and his wife and the Hartwell family, and which ended with Mrs. Prout declaring that the ranch house was very well kept for a property run by a woman who had started with 40 acres and a cow. "Agnes is still with us," Myrtle said. "How old is that cow?" Mrs. Prout asked. "Remarkably old," Cyrus said. We've stopped calculating." They all looked at Agnes, who was visible through the kitchen window in the near pasture, moving with the deliberate dignity of a very elderly animal who had no intention of rushing for anyone. "She'll outlive us all," Tom Bidwell said, which was probably not true but felt right. By the fall of 1880, the ranch had grown enough that Cyrus was considering purchasing an adjacent piece of ground to the east that had come available, the previous owner having decided to relocate to Kansas. He and Myrtle talked it through at the kitchen table over several evenings, the kind of detailed, honest conversation about money and risk and future plans that was, she had come to understand, one of her favorite things about being married to him. He did not make unilateral decisions. He did not assume she was unqualified to have a view on financial strategy. He laid the numbers out and said, "What do you think?" and then listened to what she thought, and then they decided together. They bought the east parcel. It was good ground, with a creek running through the lower portion that would water stock in dry summers, and the purchase extended their operation into something that Cyrus said, without pride but with a kind of steady satisfaction, was what he had been working toward since he came to Texas. One evening in November of 1880, Myrtle was in the sitting room with James on her lap, reading him a story from a picture book that Mrs. Pruitt had sent at Christmas the previous year, and Cyrus came in from outside and stood in the doorway watching them, and she looked up and caught the expression on his face. It was the face from the barn door, from every morning he had ridden up to find her at her mailbox, from the marriage proposal by the fire, from the March morning when he had held their son in the gray light by the window. It was the face of a man who was aware in this particular moment that he is inside the best thing in his life and knows it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." "Come sit down," she said. He came and sat beside her on the settee, and she leaned against him without interrupting the story she was reading, and James listened with the intense, slightly suspicious expression of a baby who is not yet sure about narrative structure, but is attending carefully in case it matters. The winter came. The winter went. Spring came again, the way it always did in this country, not with ceremony but with the gradual, unannounced greening of things that had seemed done, the grass coming back, the garden ready to be worked, the mornings arriving earlier and gentler. James started walking in February of 1881, which he did in the determined, slightly aggressive style of a boy who had decided that standing in place was no longer adequate to his purposes, and the house was reorganized around this new development with the speed of people who have been warned and still find themselves surprised. In the spring of 1881, Tom Bidwell fell ill. It was not unexpected. He was 75 years old and had lived a hard-working life in a hard-working country, and his heart had been giving him trouble since the winter. Clara tended him with the steady, unsentimental love of their 50 years together, and Myrtle and Cyrus came often, bringing food and company and the various small kindnesses that could be brought. On an April evening, Myrtle sat with Tom in his sitting room while Clara rested, and they talked slowly in the way of conversations where you know the time available is limited and you want to use it well. "I never apologized properly," Tom said. "For what?" she said, though she knew. "The money," he said. "It was presumptuous, and you spent months confused about it." "I spent months," she said carefully, "walking to my neighbor's door." Tom looked at her. Something in his expression shifted toward understanding. "Ah," he said. "Tom," she said, and took his large, rough hand in both of hers, "if you had put that money directly in my pocket with your name attached to it, I would have thanked you and gone home, and you would have done me a kindness that lasted a day. By putting it in the box without a name, you gave me a mystery that lasted long enough to change my life entirely." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't plan that." "I know you didn't," she said. "I think the best things don't get planned." He pressed her hand. "Your father would be very glad," he said, which was the second time he had said it to her, and the second time she had to look at the window. Tom Bidwell died in May of 1881, peacefully, in the way of men who have had good lives and made their peace with the ending of them. His passing left a quiet in Callen's Creek that was not emptiness but the particular resonance of an absence, the sound of a voice you have known so long you carry it inside you. Clara Bidwell wore her grief with the same sturdy dignity with which she had worn everything else, and Myrtle made sure that she was not alone in it, coming to her house 3 times a week through the summer and fall, bringing James, who made Clara laugh with the pure physical comedy of his toddler projects and opinions, bringing Cyrus, who sat with Clara and talked about Tom the way Clara needed to talk about him. One afternoon Clara said, "He always said you were your father's daughter," and he was right. "You are, but you're also yourself, Myrtle, and that's something better." Myrtle thought about this for a long time afterward. Being herself had led her, in the end, to a life she had not known to want. It had led her out the door on a hot August morning with a fistful of someone else's money, across a half-mile of baked clay road, to a door that opened on everything. The autumn of 1881 was golden and full. James was 18 months old and possessed of a running vocabulary of approximately 20 words, deployed with maximum efficiency and minimum regard for context, and he followed Cyrus around the property in the mornings, with the focused determination of a small person who has decided where his loyalties lie and is not interested in negotiating the matter. Cyrus bore this with a patience and tenderness that Myrtle observed from the porch, with a warmth she had stopped trying to contain or analyze, because it seemed wasteful to spend time on analysis when the thing itself was so clear. She told him in October that she was expecting again. He did not go still this time the way he had the first time. He looked at her across the kitchen table and smiled, the real, full smile, the one she had first seen on the day she brought the apple pie, and he said, "Good," and she said, "Good," and it was as simple and as complete as that. The ranch operated through the winter with the additional help of a second hand, a man named Garza who had come recommended by one of the established ranchers to the south, and proved to be skilled with both cattle and horses, and quiet in the way that made a working operation run smoothly. Myrtle managed the household accounts and the egg and cream sales and the garden planning, and the marketing of the wool from the small flock of sheep she had introduced to the operation the previous spring, over Cyrus's mild skepticism, which she had overcome by producing numbers. "You were right about the sheep," he said, in January of 1882, looking at the ledger. "I frequently am," she said. "I know," he said, and she could hear both the humor and the complete sincerity in it. Their second child, a daughter, was born in April of 1882, and they named her Eleanor after Cyrus's mother, whom he had spoken of with the particular quiet reverence of someone who has loved and lost and carries the love forward. Eleanor arrived in the world with the expression of someone who has arrived prepared for a situation they have already assessed, and she looked at her parents with dark gray eyes that would eventually settle to brown, and she was small and perfect and entirely herself from the first moment. James, at 20 months, regarded Eleanor with the scientific detachment of a person conducting a long-term study and not yet ready to form conclusions. He poked her foot once, experimentally, while Myrtle was watching, and Eleanor blinked slowly and made a sound, and James considered this data and withdrew to play with his blocks. Within a week he had decided she was interesting, which was, Myrtle thought, a reasonable progression. The spring of 1882 rolled into summer, and summer into fall, and the years began to accumulate the way years do when they are lived fully, not felt as loss but as growth, each season adding something to what had been there before, like the rings in a tree that show not age but life. Clara Bidwell came to Sunday dinner every week and had, gradually and without any particular ceremony, become part of the household in the way of a beloved grandmother, which was precisely what she was to James and Eleanor in all but blood. She taught Myrtle her recipe for sweet potato pie and pronounced James's first full sentence, which was, "I want that," to be linguistically advanced and morally predictable, and she held a leaner in her lap in the evenings with the expression of a woman who has been given more than she expected. Robbie, their first hand, married a girl from town named Bess in the summer of 1882, and Cyrus gave them the small house on the south parcel as a wedding present, which made Robbie go temporarily speechless and Myrtle squeeze Cyrus's arm, and think that she had married a good man, which she had known for a long time, and which still had the capacity to surprise her with how fully she meant it. One evening in the fall of 1882, Myrtle was sitting at the kitchen table with her accounts, and Cyrus was sitting across from her reading, and the house was quiet because both children were finally asleep after a day that had involved a great deal of activity, and the lamp was between them the way it had been on the evening he had proposed, and she looked at him over the ledger. "Cyrus," she said. He looked up. "Do you remember the first time I came to your door?" she said. "With the money," he said. "I was so prepared to stand there until it was resolved," she said. "I had the money in my hand and I was completely certain I was right and you were wrong." "You were right," he said. "Just wrong about who was wrong. And you looked at me," she said, "like you had never seen anything quite like me before." "I hadn't," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The lamp between them gave off its steady, warm light. "What were you thinking?" she asked. Actually, in that first moment, he considered this. He was always honest when he took time to consider, and she had learned to value the pauses. "I was thinking," he said, "that whoever this woman was, she was something I had not accounted for, and that my day was suddenly different than I had expected it to be." "Different good or different bad?" she asked. "I didn't know yet," he said, "but I knew it wasn't nothing." She smiled. He smiled. Outside the window the Texas night pressed its particular darkness against the glass, full of the sounds of the land they had built together, the cattle settling, the horses in the corral, the distant, periodic call of an owl from the direction of the live oaks, and the wind, always the wind, moving through the grass of the south pasture that had once been her father's 40 acres and was now, with all the rest, theirs. She went back to her accounts. He went back to his book. James and Alina slept upstairs in the rooms she had furnished carefully with things that would last. Agnes, who had defied all reasonable expectations, was in the near pasture. The tin box that had once held the mystery money was in the bottom drawer of her bureau, still containing the dried wildflowers, and now also a small lock of Alina's first dark hair wrapped in cotton and James's first tooth wrapped in a handkerchief, and the letter she had written to Cyrus in November of 1878, the one with the last line still legible. "I think I would like to know you better if you are willing." She had kept it because it was the truest thing she had ever sent to anyone, and because the answer it had gotten, in a man appearing at her door holding it in his hand with careful hope all over his face, was worth keeping close. This was the life. Not a resolved problem or a settled territory or the end of anything at all. A kitchen table, a lamp, a ledger, a book. Two people who had found each other by accident and chosen each other on purpose, every day since, in the small and ordinary ways that were the only ways that mattered. The money had been Tom Bidwell's. The mystery had been beautiful. The road between the mailboxes had been half a mile of baked clay, and entirely, incidentally, the road that had brought her home. Cyrus looked up from his book and caught her looking at him. "Accounts," he said. "I'm doing them," she said. "You're looking at me," he said. "I can do both," she said. He put the book down and looked at her properly, and she set her pencil down and looked back. And in the lamplight of that October evening in 1882, in the house on the Archer Ranch on the South Road outside Callen's Creek, Texas, they looked at each other with the full, uncomplicated, deeply earned attention of two people who have nothing to hide and no reason to look away. "Good evening, Myrtle," he said. "Good evening, Cyrus," she said. And the lamp burned on.